Hi, I'm Alex. If you've been following my channel for the last 18 months, you might have seen some of the recreations of film scores I've done using Virtual Orchestra, such as this. And this. And this. I've had a number of comments and emails asking me about my approach, and so I've decided to cover that in one video. So this is my big fat guide to using a virtual orchestra. All the music you hear throughout this video is created using virtual instruments, including this music in the background now, which is a remake of Hypersleep from Alien, which is composed by Jerry Goldsmith. I'll put a link to the remake of this in the description below. Step 1. Go and watch a real orchestra. It sounds massively patronising and obvious, but if you're trying to recreate the sound of an orchestra, go and listen to one. When I was doing my degree between 2004 and 2007, I hooked up with the local Philharmonic, made tea and coffee for them during their breaks and did running at their monthly concerts, and in return I could sit in various places in the orchestra during the rehearsals. So one week I'd sit with the bassoons, next week I'd sit with the timpani, etc. And this experience was invaluable, and I expect most of you could find a local orchestra of some description who would accommodate the same kind of arrangement. The main thing you'll notice with a real orchestra is the dynamics. We're so used to overly compressed and pumped music that we're coming from completely the wrong angle. Use the real orchestra to recalibrate your ears so that the MF or mezzo forte dynamic is your general level, and that the forte or F and fortissimo FF dynamics are spared for only the really powerful and dramatic moments. They're not the general level. And listen to how often a real orchestra is down in that P or PP dynamic, and get your ears used to that kind of sound and that kind of level. And look at the waveforms of recordings of orchestral music and film scores and see how those dynamics translate into decibels, and compare that with your own recordings. Step 2. Again, before we even switch on a computer or talk about sounds, I think it's really important to understand what sampling is and what you're trying to achieve. If I write the word sampling with my hand, that's like a live take. But say you wanted to use my handwriting when I wasn't around, I could write out all of the letters of the alphabet and you could piece the same word back together. It kind of looks like my handwriting, but it's not very well joined together, and the eye can spot that I didn't write it. This is what sampling was like in the early days, and was certainly still the case when I first used libraries in the early 2000s. As computers became faster and have more RAM and disk space, the technology has been able to grow, and developers can put way more detail in. They can sample multiple different articulations, dynamics, round robins, and sample all of the intervallic connections between notes as well as the notes themselves. This is like if I gave you hundreds or even thousands of samples of my handwriting and all the variations on how I join different letters together. This means you could get an awful lot closer to the real thing. And so that brings us to step 3, where we can turn on a computer, and that is, which libraries should I buy? Returning to my handwriting analogy, what I look for in a library is one that has as many of these variations as possible. For example, Cinesample Cinebrass has 3 different lengths of short note that can all be dynamically controlled, like this. Spitfire Audio's Symphonic Woodwinds also has 3 different kinds of short note that are dynamic, like this. This kind of thing makes a huge difference to how much control you have and what your options are when programming. Here's one final example using various short articulations within the cello patch from Spitfire Audio's Symphonic Chamber Strings. You get the point I'm trying to make. Likewise with legato, which is probably the most fundamental patch for each instrument, I look for libraries that have multiple types of attack, multiple types of transition, like fast, portamento, accented, slurred, etc., dynamic control, vibrato control, expression, different mic positions, etc., etc. Here's some examples of patches in my collection that I think pull this off. First up, the sample modelling trumpet. And the French horn from Cinebrass. Spitfire clarinet. The Spitfire chamber strings violin 1. Now, if you're used to the sound of the real instruments, you'll be able to tell that these are far from perfect, but they are close enough. And once you've got them in a mix and you've used some other techniques to blend them, which I'll show you later in this video, you can get a fairly passable result without ever having to hire a real orchestra. Now, these are just libraries I own. There are other libraries I've used that I highly recommend, such as Orchestral Tools Berlin Brass and Cinematic Studio Strings. On the screen now is a list of all the libraries I currently own and use. Now, whatever libraries you choose to use, the thing to look out for, as I said earlier, is the depth of the sampling. How many different types of short notes are there? How many different types of transitions are there? If you've got various programming controls and various options, then if something doesn't sound realistic, you've got a chance of being able to do something about it. If the patches are limited and the library is limited, then your ability to make it sound realistic is also limited. Step 4. Supplemental sounds. Orchestras are all about colour and timbre, so do you have these details available? Other than the main shorts and longs, what other articulations do your libraries have? Measured tremolo, trills, runs, flautando, rips, falls? This is what really helps bring your virtual orchestra to life. I use Orchestral Tools Metropolis 3, Berlin Strings Expansion E, Symphonic Sphere and Spitfire Audio's Evo Grid libraries for effects, rhythms, colours and textures. For example, pre-recorded rhythms, or crescendos and decrescendos, or pickups and accents, or measured trills layered with evolving harmonics. These are the kind of sounds and textures that are all over real orchestral pieces, and they sound much more realistic if they're preconceived and recorded that way, compared to trying to recreate them with standard patches. And if you don't have these sounds, you might not even be aware of what's missing from your arrangements versus real orchestras. So I think one of the simplest things to do is to go through some of the remakes I've done that I've put up on YouTube, and so we can have a look at what was in there, what sounds I used and what settings I was using. So this is the Bernard Herrmann Vertigo remake. So from the top, this audio file here that's muted is the original recording of the original soundtrack, and underneath it, the first thing I did was tempo map it, which helps with the realism and helps get the same push and pull that this has. You can see the kind of the average tempo is that, but it pushes and pulls, and it really pulls back in some places at the tail end of phrases, and it pushes at the start of certain sections. It's a good way if you're making a film score cue or an orchestral cue and you want it to have more realism. Don't forget the tempo, that's a huge part of the orchestral sound. So you can see at the top I've got woodwinds in a folder, then brass in a folder, strut percussion, tune percussion, and strings at the bottom. And that follows the same layout of conductor scores that have woodwind, brass, percussion, strings. It just makes sense to me because that's the way I'm used to looking at it. Those pull down into some group tracks down here, woodwind, brass. I've got actually 3 different percussion groups, and then strings at the bottom, and then those go to the stereo out. This harks back to the way I used to record when I first started recording in the 90s, where we were recording on tape with a mixing desk, no computer, and you'd have 8 tracks would be drums, 1 track would be bass, 4 tracks would be guitars, and 3 tracks would be vocals, something like that. But you'd then pull those down to group tracks, so you'd have 1 stereo group of drums, 1 group for bass, 1 for guitar, 1 for vocals. So you went from 16 to 4, and then from 4 you went to just a stereo out. And it's that kind of filtering process, start wide, come in until you're reducing with each stage. It just helps you make sense of things and helps the workflow. That's what I've been doing all the way since the 1990s. Even though I'm now in a digital audio workstation and it's using virtual instruments, the principle still works. So let's start at the top, and I've got woodwinds. So let's load up Contact, and they're all in here, and they are all Spitfire Symphonic woodwinds, exclusively so in fact. And you might notice that I'm using just the close mic in this instance, and that's because they have a more vintagey sound, and I'm trying to make it sound like the original Herrmann recording. And this sounds kind of more narrow and old. I don't know exactly the way they used to record back in that era, but this sound for me sounds closer to it than a tree mic. You can notice up here on Spitfire patches you can change the stereo width and the stereo pan. I recommend if you want to do that, you do that within the patches. You can get plugins that play around with the stereo image and make it narrower or wider, but separate plugins applied to stereo recordings can cause some kind of weird phasing issues. So if it's got a dedicated switch or button to do that, use that. Let's have a little flick through this. Okay, so here's a good example. While we're listening to the trills, you can see I'm using modulation for dynamics here. I've also got some expression here which is for vibrato, I believe. But you can see that I'm using different velocities at different places because the different velocities give you a different kind of attack and a different kind of sound. So here I'm lower with the velocities, here I'm higher. And here I'm somewhere in between. What's this at the end? So it's about picking the one that's appropriate for the section of music you're working on at that point. And this harks back to what I was saying about having the flexibility and having the patches that allow you to do that. If you've got a patch that whatever velocity you have it at, there's no change in the sound, it doesn't do anything different, then if you find your sound isn't realistic, there's nothing you can do about it. So let's move down to brass, see what I've got in here. I'll play it while we're looking. So I've got a mix of cine brass. Hello, there's a horn solo. So I've got a mix of core and pro. And I'm using the full mixes, but I think on all these, if we go into settings, yes, stereo width, I flicked that on and narrowed it a little bit. So this is the same principle as the Spitfire one, where I'm using the onboard programming to be able to change the sound rather than trying to apply some third-party plugin to it. We've got a mix of The usual suspects: trumpets, French horns, trombones, bass trombone and tuba. Let's have a look at this. Again, we've got some automation of dynamics. We've got sustain or not sustain. It's a nice polychord. And then we've got some volume automation as well to work with the dynamic modulation. Sometimes you find that a note isn't tailing out enough and you want to blend it back even more. That's where you use your volume automation. And you can see I'm using different velocities for different types of attack. And I'm also not having it quantized to the grid, which helps keep it a little bit looser. Let's go down. I haven't actually looked at the group. What have I got on here? I've got some Waves CLA 2A plugin compressor, which is, let's see how hard it's working. Not very, although it'll work harder now. Okay, so generally it's just pulling 1 or 2 dB, and it's only on the really banging points that it's having to compress more than that. So that's quite light compression. And then I've got Isotope Vinyl on it, which is a free plugin, which I recommend. And I've just got a little bit of wear and a little bit of warp. That's like a little bit of kind of tape, wow, and flutter. The wear just kind of dampens the sound a bit if I mute it. Quite subtle, and that's the point. You don't want to be smashing things into plugins because it just sounds unrealistic. You want to be building it up in stages, which is what I've done, because I've got Yuhi Satin on the mix bus on the stereo out, and that's adding a little bit of hiss, asperity, wow and flutter, crosstalk, and some emulation of tape. Again, it's quite subtle, but it helps blend the whole sound if I play it. Here it's not doing a massive amount, but it does make a difference to the sound. It does colour the sound and help it sound kind of old, and it also helps blur and smudge things together, which is really what you want if you consider that all these libraries are recorded, some of them in different countries, let alone different studios, and you want to try and make them sound like they're one orchestra playing together. Let's move on down. We've got strut percussion. Very quiet. Got a little bit of triangle. And we've got some timps and tam-tams. So these are all Spitfire Joby Burgess, which I highly recommend. Particularly because it has a range of different articulations. This is what I was talking about earlier. You want to be able to have the flexibility to try out different sounds if it's not sounding as you want it. So it's got normal hits, muted hits, normal rolls, muted rolls, and then it's got some different dynamics, pre-recorded swells of various lengths. Muted hits is probably the most useful patch you can get in timpani. I've had other timpani libraries before that don't have muted hits, and you hit a note and it just rings out and you want it to stop, and you wind up having to automate volume, and then you lose all the reverb of the room that it was recorded in, and it sounds terrible. So having actual muted hits that are hit and then muted so they stop, as well as the normal ones, is hugely useful. And then a bit of tam-tam at the end. Again, I was just using the tree mics on these. You want the percussion to sound a little bit further back. Let's go down to the tune percussion. Well, we've got some vibes with some motor on it. It's a really cool sound. And then we've got Celeste and 2 harps, which I'll show you now. Got the symphonic sphere harp, which is great, panned right, and I've got the harp, just the contact harp, panned left. So they're playing the 2 different parts. It's quite common to have 2 harps in film scores. And then the piano is live. I'm lucky enough to have a Yamaha U3 in my studio, so I record that because it obviously sounds real, because it is real. Let's go a little bit further on here. We've got some organ. That growly sound you can hear in the bottom, that's sound dust. That's one of Pendle's creations. If you haven't heard of sound dust, I'll put links below. Superb. Really cool libraries. So yeah, this stuff just really adds to the middle of the sound, and you'd really notice it if it wasn't there, and you'd also really notice it if it sounded unrealistic and badly done. So that's that, and that is all going to these three groups. I've got vinyl on them, no EQ. I've got a bit of EQ on the tune percussion to pull out some of that real boom from the tam-tam and the timpani, and the piano has got some EQ as well, just to level that out. And again, my favourite, the CLA2A compressor, just flattening it a little bit. But I mean, you can see it's just tickling it, just getting a dB or so of compression. That's the good thing about compression, you can just build it up in stages, a little bit on the channel, a little bit on the mix bus, and then more on the master. If you hit one compressor too hard, you'll hear it and it'll sound squashed and horrible. So build your compression up in stages. Let's have a look what else we've got in here. Strings. So this is all Spitfire chamber strings, and I've just got the close mics. Have I done anything? No. So this stereo width I've not touched. It's got a really dry sound and quite thin, but that works perfectly for this because you want it to sound quite cold. That comes over here, and a little bit of EQ just to brighten it off. And you can see I've got some automation. I'll leave this running while I'm talking. I've got some automation on this channel which I haven't done on... I've done some on the piano, I haven't done any on the woodwind, brass or other percussion. And this is about blending the sections together. So there was obviously some places where the strings were just poking through, and you could just tell that they weren't part of the same recording as the other sections of the orchestra. And you just want to be able to blur them back and just smudge the sound in places. And so that's what I've done, quite a bit there, but generally just a little bit here and there just to help smudge it back. And this is like when someone who does graphic design has to take two photographs or more photographs that weren't from the same original source and blend them together and mix them together to look like they're one image. And if that's, we can all spot badly done Photoshop, but if it's done well and it's kind of weaved in or blurred in, however they do it, it looks more natural, and it's that kind of idea. But with sound, you're trying to smudge things together and kind of caress the sound so it sounds like one cohesive thing. That's probably one of the most common mistakes I find when people play me orchestral mock-ups they've done, is that certain instruments are poking through really unrealistically. And this goes back to what I was saying about going and seeing a real orchestra. You should gauge what each section of the orchestra sounds like, but also what it sounds like when the rest of the orchestra is playing. So what do the woodwinds sound like, and now what do the woodwinds sound like when the brass are playing or when the strings are playing? Do you actually hear them, or do you just kind of feel a bit of colour from them? And get used to what they sound like in relation to each other, and then that will help you balance your mix and make it sound more realistic. And a common thing I've heard is if people put brass on something and the brass is ripping, you start to be able to hear the strings and woodwind less, which is actually what happens in real life. And so they push their woodwinds up, or to make the volume up, and then you have this odd thing of a lone flute or something above a whole brass section, which is not realistic. Or I've just noticed woo wind rather than woodwind. So bear that in mind. So yeah, this is Bernard Herrmann. I'll just play a little bit of the whole thing. there you go. I won't play the whole thing. I've already uploaded this before, so I'll put a link to that in the description. And let's move on and look at another one. Okay, so for the next example, here is the remake of Doc Returns from Back to the Future that I did. I'll put a link again in the description below. First thing again was I imported the original track as WAV file, and then I've just tempo mapped it. It was actually quite a consistent tempo, this one. It might have been done to a click, or parts of it are done to a click. A little bit of push and pull in places. So I mapped that out. And again, same layout. We've got woodwind at the top, then brass, then percussion, some live piano in there, and then strings. And there's also a couple of little bits. I played in some live violas and live double bass just to do a couple of little bits that were quite difficult to pull off. So let's go to the top and have a little listen to the woodwinds. So again, we're just using Spitfire Symphonic woodwinds. I don't think I've done anything to the stereo image, and it's just the tree this time. I'm using a lot of the multi-patches, doing key switching to flick between different articulations. And at the bottom, same principle, slightly different. I've actually mixed from the contact outputs. Having said don't play around with stereo imaging, that's exactly what I've done on this. And then I've set up some reverb here. What is it? It's just a stock reference reverb. And then I've sent some of the woodwind channel to that just to put a little bit of reverb on it. So nothing massively complicated there. There's some fast runs in here and things. If we look at the programming, some quite complicated stuff. We're using a lot of dynamic modulation, wheel stuff, and also a lot of different velocities for different kinds of attacks. So pulling that stuff off with a library that doesn't have different types of attacks and different types of shorts would be very, very difficult. There's lots of little fast little runs and things in here as well. As you can see. So that again goes back to the libraries you're using. Do they have the legs to pull this kind of stuff off? And I think Symphonic Woodwinds does. There's a really good example of using different shorts and key switching. Da 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 da. So that's more realistic than just using one type of short note. Let's move on to brass. Our old friend Cinebrass. Not done any kind of stereo image stuff this time. Oh, and there's a little bit of the original Albion. I've got the brass mids there. And I think that was, if I remember back, because they sounded better. At doing that. Than the Cinebrass equivalent in that particular instance. So this is the kind of stuff here that if you don't have the right kind of shorts, it's going to sound terrible. I think that sounds reasonable, not 100% realistic, but it's close enough. And I've got two lots of reverbs on the brass. What's the second one? A broader, bigger sound on this reverb channel than that one. And I've put the brass into that a little bit. We've got our old friend. I've got some stereo imaging again. Make it a little bit narrower. And I've got our old friend isotope vinyl here. Very subtle settings. Let's just have a quick look at the output again. This time I've got Abbey Road vinyl on it. Again, not smashing it. I mean, you can really drive it if you want, or you can really put a lot of wow and flutter and stuff into it, but I'm just using quite subtle settings. So let's have a little look at the percussion. Again, we've got 2 harps. So this one actually is a glissando patch, or glissandi patch, which has pre-made runs and glissandis that you control what type of what key there and what kind of scale it is there. So I needed, in this case, an octatonic one. Alan Silvestri loves his octatonic scales, and conveniently there's one in there, so that sounds realistic because it's conceived and recorded that way. And then we've got a lot of the Spitfire audio stuff again. I'm just trying to see if I've done something. On some of these I've narrowed the stereo image, on the xylophone for example. Let's find a place where they're playing. The piano is obviously totally dry because it's recorded in a small studio. So I've got that coming to a group here. Oh, I've got some vinyl on it yet again. Tiniest bit of EQ. On a side note, that's one of the great things about a Yamaha U3 is it has got a very smooth sound and it records really well. You don't have to do piles of EQing or compressing to get it to sit. It's quite well balanced on its own, as you can hear. You can see the edits there, how many takes I had to do to put that together. And then moving, oh, I put a live triangle in there. Because that obviously sounded realistic, more realistic than the sample for that particular sound. Let's move on down to strings. So this is a lot of sounds, as you can see. And start here. We've got Berlin Expansion E. Now imagine trying to pull that off without a library like this that's got those pre-made. That would be impossible, which is why I say you need these kind of supplemental libraries like this to pull this kind of stuff off. So let's play that again. Then we've got some more standard pitches here. It's a time machine patch, which means you can stretch the audio, make it longer or shorter, which is very, very handy. There was some of the live strings you just heard just very briefly there. Carry on down. Oh, and we've got some LA scoring strings at the bottom, which are the legatos, I think, which we're going to hear in this section here. And there's an example of trying to pull off a run that's very fast. You can see the amount of programming I've done. It's also how the notes overlap. If the notes don't overlap, or they overlap more or less, that affects the sound. The velocity, the modulation of dynamics, the volume, and that's vibrato as well. So let's listen to the two individually. This is Spitfire chamber strings. It's pretty versatile. And LA scoring strings. And the two together. It's not 100% realistic, it's not 100% perfect, but in the mix you can get away with it. As you can hear. And then we've got some shorts and things at the end. And here's a little note: if you've got short phrases, always make sure your dynamics are following. You'd probably accent downbeats if you had something like this. A triplet, you'd probably have strong start and stronger end, and the middle would be the weaker one. Let's listen to that on its own. Same again. I've got two libraries layered there. Lass is a much drier library, and it has quite a Hollywood sound, whereas the Spitfire stuff has got a very kind of British film score sound, and it's a much bigger, wetter sound. But the two work together quite well, I find. That's the two on top of each other. And some runs to finish off. So as you can see, it's a combination of lots of different libraries that I've got that can pull off all the kinds of sounds I need, and a lot of complex mixing that comes down to just those main filters, funnels down to those group channels at the end. I've got some reverbs to blend things together, and I've got some vinyl emulation on the output. So that's this one. Okay, and then last but not least, I've got this one, which is A Canadian in Mayfair by Angela Morley, which is from the 1950s. I uploaded this under the title My Computer is a 1950s Orchestra. It might be the first video of mine you saw. It's still the most popular video on my channel. This was actually done originally on a much older computer than this, so I've had to reload it in here and reinstate it. For example, if I go in here, it's not even Spitfire Symphonic Woodwinds, it's the BML range, which came before that. It's the same samples, it's just before they repackaged it and improved some of the programming. I have replaced some of the patches that were Cinebrass Core originally with Pro, because they're supposed to be muted, and they weren't originally because I didn't have Pro at the time, so I didn't have the muted articulations. And in here we've got a mix of drums and things. I've replaced this vibraphone with Joby Burgess, but I didn't have Joby Burgess at the time, so I used a lot of just the stock contact stuff for this. And then the strings are chamber strings. So let's have a quick listen. Okay, you get the idea. I'll put a link to the original of this, which is the entire thing, if you want to watch that. So let's start at the top and have a listen to what I've got. I've got the woodwinds again, and I've used the close mics again, and I've narrowed some of the stereo images very slightly. Then we've got some programming here. You can actually see the velocities are quite flat on this, but that seemed to work for this particular piece. You can see how complicated some of the dynamic programming got, sitting things together. But the good thing with these woodwinds is they're very nimble, so for a lot of these really fast runs that you're hearing, that kind of acrobatic stuff, it works really well with the Spitfire woodwinds. This group of woodwinds are then coming down again, same idea. I've got a channel down here, I've got a little bit of compression on it, very subtle, little bit of EQ. I tend to take the bottom end out of woodwinds because you don't really want the bottom end of them. It tends just to be kind of woofy air that just takes up headroom and makes the mix a bit muddy. And then I've done some automation there, and then I've sent it to this reverb here, which is a plate reverb, I believe. Yep, just a plate. And then I sent the plate reverb to a group channel called Plate Out, and then I narrowed the stereo image of the plate reverb, which seems to work. So the reverb is actually in mono because it was making things sound a bit too wide. So that's another little trick you can pop up your sleeve. And then the stereo out, I've put a Wolf compressor on it. I didn't use Wolf compressor at the time. I think I used something else like He Satin or something. But that is quite heavy on the lo-fi. A little bit of wow and flutter. And dry and Wolf is how much dry to wet signal you have. So it's like parallel compression basically. You're having a mix of uncompressed signal over this side or compressed signal this way. The benefit of that is that the uncompressed signal maintains the dynamics more, whilst blended in with a compressed signal which beefs it up, rather than in the whole thing sounding squashed by a compressor. Let's have a listen to the brass. So look at some of the programming. So in isolation they don't actually sound that impressive, but in the mix they work. I'll play that section. And that's it, you're trying to blend stuff back. You can see I've done some leveling here. You might not be able to get it to sound exactly realistic in isolation, but if you can smudge it in and blend it into the mix, job done. I have put some crescendos in from Metropolis Arc, which I didn't have at the time. I don't think it was even released at the time, just here. So you get those realistic crescendos. And yeah, there's quite a lot of automation you can see. So sustains is within the patches, you can flip between short notes and sustained notes. A lot of different playing around with velocities. You get different types of legatos, different types of shorts with different velocities. Modulation is dynamics, and an awful lot of mapping and programming there. And then volume automation as well, particularly to tail notes away so that they feel natural. And that's all about getting it to sit. Let's play a couple of contrasting sections of these. So that's that. That's making use of what those libraries do, understanding. You can see it here on the mapping, in fact. There's your different types of shorts. They have them as eighths, quarters, halves, and you can decide what velocity range you get those within. And you get those both for short and for longs or legatos. You can also map whether it's polyphonic or whether it's monophonic. So that's that. Oh, another thing with Cinesamples is they have triggers at the bottom for these ones here. If you want repeated notes like triplets or half notes, which sound more realistic than jabbing the key multiple times, but I often forget that's there, in fact. But that is a very cool feature. Move down to percussion. Actually, I should show you where the bones go. Again, they have their own channel. Just a little bit of EQ, brighten up the top, and then they're going to the reverb as well. Okay, down to percussion. So that's ooh. So I've got them sounding quite distant, and you want your percussion quite soft in this style of music. In fact, I read specifically an interview with Angela Morley where she said that they used to put coats on the drums to try and mute them as much as possible, and you want that stuff kind of to sit back. Now these are those symphonic sphere harp patches, and this is where you can set all the pedalling like you properly would on a real harp, and then you can store them to a key switch. So I've put that one on CC1, CC26. So if I go to that patch, you'll see all these different channels, and they're all these little bits of data are telling it to switch, and then you get this kind of thing, or this. And it's the correct pedalling. I had the full score from this, which I hired at the time, and it had all the pedalling on, so I just went through it and mapped all the proper pedalling, and I think it sounds quite realistic. So those are those, and they're going to percussion channel, which has got some reverb on it, and I've really narrowed the stereo image. Let me just demonstrate that. So you can hear it suddenly goes stereo and then pulls in. I think it sounds better, kind of narrow. It helps it smudge to the background a bit. So that's why I did that. Let's move on to strings. So measured tremolos again. And on the pizzicato, where on earth are they? Not in there. In a different instance of contact. I've got a mix of close and tree, and on some of them I've just got close. In fact, the violins and violas have just got close, and it's only the basses and the cello that have got a bit of tree in there. Have I done anything to the stereo image? Let's have a little look. Yes, I've done some bits to narrow those off. And then these are going, I've got a Pitts channel, it's got some EQ up there, and it's got some reverb on it, and then I've got a legato channel which has got some slightly different EQ, and it's got some Abbey Road on there just to smudge it and blur it and make it a little bit saturated, and help it sit in the mix a bit more. Okay, a note on pizzicato programming. One of the most common mistakes I hear that makes things sound unrealistic is hitting the dynamics way too hard, and also having them really quantized. You can see mine aren't, although they look to be together within certain patches. They're not right on the grid, and you can look at the dynamics. They're down, and I'm only accenting beats, and then it's softer in between. And that really helps it sound more realistic, because in real life the players don't yank the strings while doing pizzicato. I mean, I could even pull this stuff just to demonstrate, pull it right down out of interest. I don't know if that's done it to everything. Let's pull it right down. It might sound even better, even lower. The lower the better with pizzicato. Obviously you've got to make it audible, but I mean, I think that sounds even better. I mean, it would probably get lost in the mix. Let's hear it now. Yeah, I mean, you've lost it in the mix, but if I resat that actually sounds better. And if you compare that to, just for comedy value, if I smash it all the way up, as I quite often hear people do, amazingly. There we go, we're all the way up. See how unrealistic this sounds. Terrible. And you'll be surprised how often people do that. Yeah, keep your dynamics down on pizzicato and make sure you've got the accents, and those are the ones that poke up a bit, and that's because if you look at real players playing pizzicato, it's hard to snap your fingers on the strings, especially at that kind of speed, so you're not whacking them every time at F or FF. You're really down in that P, MP, MF kind of dynamic with only the accented notes poking through. Okay, so let's move on to the legato patches. Have a look at those. So I've got tree mics on those, I think. Yes, just because the close mics just sound a bit odd on their own with legato stuff. So let's have a little listen. So there are places that I've got the velocity programming really high, but this section in the middle, which is really complicated on the harmony, if I show you this, the whole thing, the harmony is huge. Incredible harmony, in fact. But you can see how much I've worked at how things are overlapping, whether they're just ahead, just behind. It's really not quantized at all. Each individual patch I went through and did it. You've got mapping of obviously dynamics as per usual, velocity, very important there, vibrato as well. So if you listen to this on its own, I think that sounds reasonable, especially when sat back in the mix. Let's just listen to one instrument on its own to get an idea. I think that sounds quite decent, and that's really leaning on the patches and how they're programmed and designed. These are the performance legato patches that they brought out after they brought out Spitfire chamber strings the first time. So they were an add-on where they combined all the different types of legato into one patch, so that you weren't key switching around or loading up loads and loads of patches, and they're really good. I mean, they're quite heavy on memory, but they're just really nifty, and I think that sounds really realistic for a virtual violin. So yeah, so that's that. So to sum up everything from this video, 1. Go and watch a real orchestra and study the sound of individual sections and how the sections relate to each other. 2. Understand what sampling is and how it works. 3. Pick the right libraries. Make sure you're using libraries that have the depth that you require to pull off the results that you require. 4. Arm yourself with supplemental libraries that have pre-made and preconceived articulations that are difficult to pull off with normal patches. 5. Putting it down. Use all of the tools at your disposal in your recreations: velocity, note overlaps and placement, dynamic control, vibrato, speed and tightness expression and volume, etc, etc. When mixing, start broad and then funnel your channels down from individual instruments to group channels, and from group channels to mix bus, from mix bus to master. Make use of different mic positions and use gentle compression and EQ across the group channels to blend and glue your sections, or to make the sections to sit together cohesively. Let the quieter instruments disappear into the mix in a natural way. Don't let things poke out like a badly photoshopped photo. And use your compression and EQ on the mix bus to glue the entire mix. Keep it subtle and use gain staging to balance things gradually. Don't smash individual plugins hard. And also accept that libraries have come on leaps and bounds in the last 2 decades and will likely continue that trajectory. There are still limitations, and you will find some pieces lend themselves to virtual instruments better than others. And that concludes my big fat guide to using a virtual orchestra. I hope that was helpful. I've had a lot of people send messages about it, so I thought if I do a massive long video, that will cover off everything, I hope. But if you do have any more questions, stick them in the comments below and I will answer them when I get a moment. If you're new to the channel and you like it, please subscribe. If you like this video, hit like. It really helps a small channel like mine to grow. Thank you very much, and I'll catch you on the next one.